The moment my ex raised his glass of single malt across the crowded ballroom and called out, "Still debugging spreadsheets for that little startup, Maya? How quaint." I felt 11 years collapse into a single, suffocating second. The room had gone quiet. The kind of quiet that only happens when a space full of people is secretly relieved it isn't them. Former classmates in tailored suits and cocktail dresses paused their conversations, turning toward us with that familiar, terrible curiosity. A few people near him chuckled softly. The sound of it landed in my chest exactly the way it used to. Like a key turning in a lock I thought I'd finally changed. He stepped out from his circle, all polished confidence and Bay Street posturing, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first year's salary. He tilted his head at me with that smirk I once thought was sophisticated and now recognized for what it always had been: contempt wearing a mask of ease. "I mean, good for you for showing up," he said, lowering his voice, just enough so the people nearest to us could hear without it carrying too far across the room. "Personally, I wasn't sure you'd make it past the dress code." More laughter. Quieter this time, but it was there. "My name is Maya Osi. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Scarborough, east of Toronto, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a long-term care home, and a father who drove a TTC bus for 23 years. I was the first in my family to attend university, and I worked 3 part-time jobs to do it. I was not supposed to be at the University of Toronto. Or at least, that was what a significant number of people seemed to believe, including, for a long time, myself. I met Carter Webb in second year. He was in law, I was finishing a computer science degree, and when he first started paying attention to me, I thought I'd somehow stumbled into a life I didn't quite belong in. He was brilliant in the way people from particular families are brilliant. Easily, loudly, in rooms that were already arranged to make them look their best. He's magnetic and sure of himself, and came from a family whose name was on a wing of a building at Queen's Park. Being with Carter felt, for a while, like permission to take up space I'd been apologizing for my entire life. I should have understood what I was dealing with from the beginning. But when you've spent most of your life being told, not always in words, that you're one rung too low for the room you're standing in, it's remarkably easy to mistake someone's attention for proof that you deserve to be there. We dated for nearly 3 years. The end came at a party in the Annex, our senior year, in front of a room full of people holding red plastic cups and pretending not to listen. Carter hadn't been cruel about it in any dramatic way. His particular cruelty was always quieter than that, which made it harder to name afterward. He told me in a voice that was almost gentle that he needed to think about his future. That he was heading toward things I probably couldn't picture for myself. That he hoped I'd find something that suited where I was at. I didn't cry until I was on the subway home. I cried for most of the ride to Kennedy Station, quietly enough that the man across from me didn't look up from his phone, and then I stopped because I had a morning shift at the campus library. And I needed to sleep. For years, those words, something that suited where I was at, lodged in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. I threw everything I had into my work. I graduated. I joined a small tech startup out in the Waterloo corridor when it was still 4 people working out of a rented space above a burrito place off King Street. I coded and shipped and broke things, and fixed them and learned, over several unglamorous years, that I was actually very good at what I did. I didn't celebrate that the way I probably should have. I just kept going. I met my husband at a startup pitch event in Kitchener on a Tuesday night in February, when the roads were icy and the coffee at the venue was terrible, and I was strongly considering leaving by 8:30. He was presenting a tech company he'd co-founded the previous year, Northbridge Tech, 12 employees, building enterprise infrastructure software out of an office near the university. I was there representing the startup I'd helped grow from 4 people to over 40. We ended up in the same conversation during the networking portion of the evening and discovered, fairly quickly, that we had identical opinions about several things. distributed systems architecture, the underrated excellence of Niagara Peninsula Riesling, and the specific exhaustion of building a company in a country where investors are warm and interested, and quietly, consistently skeptical, in ways that are never quite said out loud. I'm not sure when exactly I knew. There was no singular moment, no pivot point I could point to later. It was more that I kept wanting to stay in the conversation. And then I did stay, longer than made any practical sense on an icy February Tuesday, and then we figured out everything else from there. We married 3 years later. Our son Noah arrived 14 months after that. He was 4 now, full of non-negotiable opinions about dinosaurs, the correct color for truck wheels, and what constituted an acceptable number of crackers at snack time. He was the best thing I had ever had any part in creating. And I said that as someone who had once shipped a software update on which 300,000 users depended without a single production outage. The alumni gala invitation arrived in March. My first instinct was to delete it, not because I was afraid. Exactly. I'd stopped being afraid of Carter Webb. Somewhere around the year, I realized I could do things he'd never be capable of doing, but because I didn't see the point. I had a life I loved, a husband who was my actual favorite person, and a child who greeted me every morning by throwing both arms around my neck and announcing the day's schedule as though I were an executive who needed briefing. I didn't need to revisit where I'd come from to know where I was. But something made me RSVP yes. Some small, stubborn part of me that still carried that old splinter. I told myself it was closure. Walk in, feel nothing particular, walk back out, close the chapter without making it a production. My husband had planned to come with me, but Noah had been slightly off all week with a cold, and we'd agreed he would stay home with our son and drive over later if things settled. He'd bring our nanny when he came, he said. Maybe Noah could wave at the chandeliers. I drove to the Fairmont Royal York alone and walked in with a glass of sparkling water and very reasonable expectations. Carter had been doing well by the looks of it. Senior partner at a firm with offices on Bay and King. The suit was impeccable. The watch was the kind people buy when they want other people to notice the watch. He was holding court near the bar with 3 or 4 former classmates who laughed at the right moments. And I might have walked past without incident if he hadn't spotted me first and decided that spotting me was an opportunity. Maya Osei. He said my name a little too loudly, a little too pleased. Every head in our vicinity turned. I genuinely wasn't sure you'd come. I smiled at him evenly. I genuinely almost didn't. He tilted his head. The old gesture. The one that used to make me feel like I was being assessed and might or might not pass. Still writing code for that little startup? I moved on from that company a while ago. Freelancing then? Consulting? Something like that. He laughed, and the ring of people around him echoed it on cue. You know, I always respected how grounded you stayed. Not everyone needs to swing for the fences. There's real integrity in knowing where you fit. There it was, 11 years, and he was still using the same blade wrapped in the same soft cloth. That's a generous framing, I said. I just call it honestly. He took a step closer, tilting into the particular intimacy of someone performing for a nearby audience. I'm actually in the middle of closing the biggest deal of my career, representing the Whitmore Group in a tech acquisition out of Waterloo, company called Northbridge Tech. You've probably heard of them. They're in your world, right? Infrastructure software, enterprise clients, Series B funded. He paused, letting the syllables of it settle. We're talking somewhere north of 8 figures by the time it's done. Different universe from the startup circuit. He smiled at me over the rim of his glass. Some of us ended up exactly where we aimed. I looked at him. I kept my face still. I know Northbridge, I said. Carter laughed once, short, dismissive, the kind of laugh specifically designed to end a conversation by making one person feel like a footnote in someone else's story. Right. Maybe you've crossed paths at a conference? Or sat in on one of their webinars? Something like that. He shook his head with an air of patient, generous condescension, turning back slightly toward his circle. Listen, it was good to see you. Genuinely. I always hoped things would work out for you, Maya. At your own pace, in your own way. He lifted his glass toward me as though toasting my modest, appropriate life. I took a breath. There was something I could have said. I almost did say it. But I didn't have to. Because from somewhere near the entrance hall, I heard a sound I would have recognized through the middle of a blizzard. A small boy, at full sprint, shouting at an unmodulated, 4-year-old volume. Mommy! Mommy! Daddy's here! Daddy's right outside the door! The room took a collective, audible breath. Noah came barreling through the cluster of guests near the entrance with the total, unstoppable conviction of a child who has spotted his mother, and therefore all other considerations are secondary. Our nanny was several paces behind him, slightly out of breath, holding a small jacket she hadn't managed to get him to keep on. He crossed the ballroom at speed, locked eyes with me the way he always did, with that perfect, uncomplicated certainty, and reached me and wrapped both arms around my knees. Daddy parked the car, he announced breathlessly. He said give him 1 minute, but then he'll be inside. I crouched down and held him for a moment with my whole arms. He was warm and solid, and smelled like the orange bottle shampoo we'd been buying since he was an infant. He leaned into me with the full, unself-conscious weight of someone who has never once doubted they are exactly where they belong. And I held him and breathed, and when I stood back up, I was a different person than I'd been 2 minutes before. Carter was staring at us. The smirk was gone entirely. Something cautious had taken its place. Is that your son? Yes. You're married? I am. He cleared his throat. Who? The main doors of the ballroom opened. My husband didn't make an entrance. He never did. He simply walked in the way he always walked into a room. Unhurried, directional, scanning until he found me, and then made his way across the floor with no particular interest in anything else in the space. He'd come in his charcoal suit, the good one, and was carrying his jacket over one arm the way I'd known he would, because he'd probably let Noah wear it in the back seat on the drive over. He was halfway across the room when I watched Carter's face change. Not gradually. All at once, the way a screen goes dark. The color drained out completely, and his expression moved through 5 different things in the space of 2 seconds. Recognition, then calculation, then something that was unmistakably dread, before it set into something rigid and carefully blank. My husband reached us. He draped his jacket over a nearby chair, pulled me briefly into his side with one arm, and then lifted Noah with the ease of someone who has done it 10,000 times. Our son made a small, satisfied sound and looped both arms around his father's neck. Traffic on the Gardner, my husband said to me. Should have taken the DVP. He looked at Noah. This one narrated the entire drive. I saw a red truck, Noah clarified, seriously. Then my husband looked at Carter. There was a pause, not long, just enough to exist as a pause, before Carter said in a voice I had genuinely never heard him use, careful and just slightly elevated. Elliot. Hey. I didn't realize you'd be here. I didn't know that Maya was. I had no idea you two were. She's my wife, my husband said. His voice was perfectly even. The kind of neutral that people who spend a great deal of time in boardrooms develop for moments that matter. Right, Carter laughed briefly, a compressed, strained sound. Of course. Maya and I actually go way back. We went to U of T together. We actually used to. I know who you are. My husband shifted Noah to his other side. Maya's mentioned you. The silence that followed had texture. Carter straightened slightly, working to recover the footing that had always come so naturally to him. I watched him find it, or try to. Well, listen, since I have you here, I've been meaning to loop in Northbridge on some of the Whitmore terms. There are a few points I think we can work with. And if you have 5 minutes, I'd actually love to. Carter. My husband looked at him. Still calm, No edge in the voice, no heat, which somehow made it more absolute than heat would have. I was standing by the door when I came in. I heard what you said to my wife. Carter's jaw shifted. Listen, that was just. We were catching up. Maya knows I was kidding. We have that kind of history where I've spent 8 years building Northbridge, my husband said. Every hire I've made, every partnership I've signed, every investor relationship I've maintained. I've built all of it on the same principle. That character isn't separate from capability. That how a person treats someone they've decided doesn't matter tells you more about them than anything they've ever put on paper. He held Carter's gaze for a moment. I'm withdrawing Northbridge from the Whitmore acquisition process. Effective tonight. The room had gone very still, the kind of still where people realize something real is happening, and they cannot look away. Carter's face cycled through panic and calculation and landed on a desperate attempt at recovery. Elliot, if you'd just hear me out. This was completely out of context. You have to understand we have a history. This was nothing. This doesn't have to affect the deal. We're done here. He said it pleasantly. That was the thing. He said it the way you close a door. That was never particularly important to you. And then he stopped, looking at Carter altogether, and looked at me, and the shift in his expression. From that measured, settled quiet to something open and warm and entirely personal. Was the same shift I had watched happen thousands of times. And it still did what it always did, which was make everything outside the two of us feel very far away. Should we get out of here? He asked. Yes, Noah answered on behalf of both of us. I want crackers. Somewhere in the room, someone laughed. A single, involuntary, helpless sound. Not cruel. Just the sound of a room full of adults being completely disarmed by one small person's very clear priorities. A few more people joined it, and then it faded, and we were already moving toward the door. I picked up my clutch from the bar. I did not look at Carter Webb. I did not look at the cluster of former classmates who had been chuckling along with him half an hour ago, and were now watching us leave with an expression I didn't have the interest to read. I walked out between my son and my husband, through the revolving doors of the Royal York, and the November air came off Lake Ontario and hit all three of us at once. That particular Toronto autumn, cold, clean, and sharp, the kind that makes you breathe deeper than you intended. I stopped for a moment on Front Street. My husband was hailing a cab. Noah had his face pressed to the back of his father's shoulder, already fading toward sleep. One small hand fisted in the lapel of that charcoal suit. The CN Tower threw its light across a thin strip of wet pavement. The streetcars ran. People walked past us in wool coats, heading toward Union Station, toward the path, toward 1,000 ordinary Thursday night lives. I stood there for a moment and breathed. I had spent a very long time carrying something that night. The splinter Carter put in me in an annex kitchen 11 years ago, in a voice that was almost gentle, the part of myself that had turned his assessment over and over, looking at it from different angles, wondering in the early hours of otherwise unremarkable mornings whether maybe he'd seen something true about me that I hadn't wanted to look at directly. Standing on Front Street with the cold off the lake against my face, I understood that the weight was simply gone. Not because of anything that had just happened in that ballroom. Though I would be lying if I said watching the color drain out of Carter Webb's face hadn't been, in some small and honest way, deeply satisfying. But that wasn't what had released it. What had released it was the realization that the version of me Carter had looked at tonight, the one he'd assessed and categorized and dismissed inside the first 30 seconds, the same way he had when we were 20, that version had not existed for a very long time. I'd just been too busy living to notice exactly when she'd gone. Carter Webb had seen a dress code infraction and a cautionary tale. He'd seen someone easy to use as a punchline. He had looked at me and seen everything I used to be afraid was true about myself. And he'd acted accordingly, because that's the only way Carter knew how to look at people. through the specific lens of who he decided they were before they had a chance to show him otherwise. He had never once seen what was actually standing in front of him. A cab pulled up. My husband opened the door and settled Noah across their laps in the back seat, and our son made the small, contented sound of a child, who is approximately 3 minutes from sleep. And I got in, and we drove north through the city. I watched the lights of Yonge Street scroll past the window, the storefronts and the restaurants, the TTC buses steaming in the cold, the ordinary, beautiful, unceasing texture of a city I had come to from Scarborough with a transit card and a scholarship and a particular private stubbornness about belonging somewhere in it. It had not always been easy. It had not always been clear. There had been years when I had worked jobs I didn't love to afford a life I was building in the dark by feel, without any guarantee it would become anything at all. But here we were. Noah breathing slow and even against his father's shoulder. The city sliding past the fogged glass. The cold lake air still on my skin. My real life had not begun when I married well, or when the startup I'd quietly helped build became something people in the industry talked about with respect, or when I walked out of a hotel ballroom with my head straight. My real life had begun long before any of those things. In a campus library, before a morning shift, at a keyboard at 2 in the morning, in a poorly ventilated event space in Kitchener on an icy February Tuesday, when the coffee was bad and I almost left early and didn't. It had begun every single time I chose, without applause and without anyone watching, to keep going anyway. That was what Carter had never understood about me, and what he never would. He had always seen himself as the story, the measure, the room you were either granted entry to or turned away from. But I had never been asking for his admission. I had been building my own room, quietly, for years. I just didn't make a fuss about it until the walls were solid and the foundation was set, and there was absolutely nothing left for anyone to take from me. Noah sighed in his sleep. My husband reached over without looking and found my hand in the dark of the cab, the way he always did, the way I still hadn't gotten used to. The easy, certain way of someone who simply knows where you are. I looked out at the city lights, blurring in the cold window glass, and I felt nothing but grateful. Quietly, completely, without performance or audience. Just grateful.